Welcome to UN Mapped History. On this video we will be exploring the international relationship of China and the US during the Korean War, while exclusively focusing on UN forces advancement across the 38th parallel into North Korea. We will begin with a quote of President Harry Truman. Recent events in Korea and elsewhere constitute a grave threat to the peace of the world and imperil the efforts of this country and those of the United Nations to prevent aggression and armed conflict. On December 16, 1950, President Harry Truman addressed the United States citizens regarding the expanding conflict in Korea. While directly addressing the American public, the president proclaimed that the United Nations' main priority is to, quote, prevent aggression and armed conflict, unquote. However, in contrast, the complete opposite was occurring in Korea. The UN's early military actions in October 1950 revealed the contradiction of preventing an aggressive war. The UN forces led by General MacArthur had crossed the 38th parallel 2 months before the proclamation, turning a defensive war into an offensive. No longer were the UN forces protecting the sovereignty of South Korea, but pursuing the objective of creating a united Korea. The United Nations resolution on June 27, 1950, was the initial guideline for the expected outcome of the Korean conflict. The resolution reads, quote, "Members of the United Nations furnish such assistance to the Republic of Korea as be necessary to repel the armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area," unquote. According to the UN Council's original plan, the UN military's mission is over once peace and order are restored. In addition to the United Nations operating procedures in Korea, historian James Matray divulges in his article the purpose of U.S. involvement in the war in Korea. He writes that in June of 1950, Dean Acheson, the U.S. Secretary of State, quote, declared publicly that American efforts in Korea were aimed only at upholding the rule of law in international affairs and preserving the credibility of the United Nations, unquote. At this time, the United States was attempting to gain national support for the war effort in Korea. Acheson would later announce that military action, quote, is solely for the purpose of restoring the Republic of Korea to its status prior to the invasion from the north, and of reestablishing the peace broken by that aggression, unquote. The U.S. Secretary of State publicly stated the initial intentions for military action to foreign and domestic world leaders. While the UN and U.S. announced the initial motivation for entering the Korean War in June of 1950, it would drastically alter after the UN military forces steadily turned the tide of war. As UN forces started to show success on the battlefield and prepared for the upcoming Incheon landing, U.S. officials began to view the idea of Korean unification as more attainable. In the National Security Council Report 81, dated September 1, 1950, the Council made its case for Korean unification. The Council made its case by referencing previous resolutions that called on unifying Korea. The Council reported, "The political objective of the United Nations in Korea is to bring about the complete independence and unity of Korea in accordance with the General Assembly resolutions of November 14, 1947, December 12, 1948, and October 21, 1949. In the report, the Security Council addressed the possible threats to pursuing Korean unification. These threats included the possibility of China and the Soviet Union entering the war. While addressing these threats, the Council fixated on the Soviet Union threat more than the possible Chinese threat. But at this time, there had been reports of Chinese forces gathering in North Korea. After the Joint Chiefs of Staff reacted with solid support of the National Security Council Report 81, historian Matray remarks on this support. He writes, "American leaders abandoned their earlier opposition to crossing the 38th parallel and now advocated the pursuit of forcible reunification. Even with the newly found support for the reunification of Korea, the Joint Chiefs of Staff grossly underestimated China's military capabilities. The first fatal flaw of Washington guidelines was de-emphasizing China's military abilities." Matray explains the JCS instructions for military engagement in crossing the 38th parallel by stating, "If Moscow intervened, MacArthur should withdraw to the parallel and notify the United Nations. If, however, the Chinese intervened, the JCS should instruct MacArthur to continue military operations, as long as action by UN military forces offers a reasonable chance of successful resistance." The discount of Chinese military capabilities is a common theme in the U.S. rhetoric when accessing Chinese threats. There were many instances where the U.S. government saw the Soviet Union as the primary threat. Still, at the same time, China was considered incapable of causing a severe threat to the UN military force. Even after the CIA reported that there were an estimated 246,000 and 374,000 troops located near the Korean border, China was still not considered a threat. However, with the mass quantities of soldiers that assembled on the border of North Korea, it is irresponsible not to consider hundreds of thousands of readied troops as a threat. This irresponsibility resulted from the historical precedents of ethnocentric ideology in the United States. Furthermore, the widespread ideology of Chinese people being inferior to the average American citizen would only fuel the impossible nature of the Chinese military withstanding the UN forces. While many nations were a part of the UN military force, the United States had the majority of command and decisions regarding military action due to General MacArthur being the commander of the UN forces. U.S. control of the UN forces allowed for the driving force of ethnocentric ideology to interfere with military operations. This ideology contributed to the discount in Chinese military capabilities. In contrast to the idea of ethnocentric ideology being the reason for discounting China's military, another viewpoint proposed is that the CCP is not a threat because they were just involved in the brutal Chinese Civil War that was detrimental to the military and economy. Furthermore, in a telegram to Stalin, Mao reports his hesitance to assist North Korea in the war. He writes on October 3rd, "If we advance several divisions and the enemy forces us to retreat, and this moreover provokes an open conflict between the USA and China, then our entire plan for peaceful construction will be completely ruined, and many people in the country will be dissatisfied. The wounds on the people by the war have not yet healed. We need peace." Even with his concerns about getting into a war with the USA, Mao finds the UN forces' ever-increasing encroachment toward the 38th parallel an act of aggression. The CCP cannot overlook the prospect of aggression since the United States did not recognize the CCP as the sanctioned government of China. The US, rather than recognize the CCP, helped fund the nationalist Chinese government in the Chinese Civil War. In addition to the perception of U.S. aggression, Mao began to prepare his troops for conflict if UN forces crossed the 38th parallel. Even with consistent threats and holding a large army around the border of North Korea, it was not enough to deter the aggression of the U.S. With sheer force of numbers, Mao is showing a statement of his intent of war. Even if Mao was hesitant, the CCP showed military strength by sheer numbers. Stalin's advisor Rostchin explains Mao's operational intent in a telegram. He relays, "Mao Zedong believes that in order to defeat one U.S. corps, the Chinese should have 4-to-1 superiority in human force and 3-to-1 superiority in technical equipment." In this telegram, Mao asked Stalin for assistance while creating a military strategy to counter the United Nations advancements in North Korea. This telegram was only 4 days after Mao wrote to Stalin announcing his hesitance to get into a war with the United States. The idea that the U.S. discounted China's military capabilities because of the Chinese Civil War does not hold up due to the consistent use of threats and massive amounts of coordinated military force disclosed by the CCP. The U.S. State Department knew the Chinese intent to participate in the Korean War if aggressive actions took place by crossing the 38th parallel. In addition to the ethnocentric ideology, the constant use of inciting communist expansionary fear contributed to animosity towards the CCP. In the National Emergency Proclamation by Harry Truman, the president utilizes this fearful language to invoke fear and emotion about the Korean War. For example, he exclaims, "If the goal of communist imperialism were to be achieved, the people of this country would no longer enjoy the full and rich life they have with God's help built for themselves and their children. They would no longer enjoy the blessings of the freedom of worshiping as they severally chose." President Truman invokes fear of communist expansion and the need to repel its advancements in the world. Invoking the fear of communism and the threat it has on American citizens' freedom creates an emotional attachment. Furthermore, with this use of fear, people are no longer interested in the semantics of the operations of the war. They are only worried about stopping and ending communism. Truman seemingly used this proclamation to create support for the offensive war taking place in Korea. Later in the declaration, Truman calls upon American citizens to unite because of the threat to national security. He exclaims that the United States is under direct threat of communist expansion and that the U.S. must be ready to repel any and all threats against our national security. By noting a possible threat and calling for the preparation of threats by U.S. citizens, President Truman is inciting fear to the public. Whether President Truman genuinely feared expansionary communism in the United States is undetermined. Still, by further expressing communist expansionary fear-mongering upon the public, it allowed for national support to stop the ability for communism to spread in Korea. The U.S. government used this national support to gain the favor of creating a united Korea. Communication between the U.S. State Department and the higher U.S. governmental command was the last line of defense in preventing an escalation of force and the decision to advance UN forces to cross the 38th parallel. This communication was utterly absent and thus did nothing to prevent an escalation of war. From July to October, China relayed threatening statements to foreign diplomats about the retaliatory actions they would pursue if the UN military crossed the 38th parallel. These diplomats then relayed this information to the U.S. State Departments. For instance, on September 30th, a memorandum by the Director of Chinese Affairs was sent to the Assistant Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs, communicating information about the advancements of Chinese troops in North Korea. Oliver Clubb, the Director of Chinese Affairs, stated in his report that he received information from Chinese officials declaring, "Chinese Communist authorities are deeply concerned over the course of events in Korea and would regard the advance of UN forces to the Manchurian border as a serious threat to their regime. The final decision on whether the Chinese Communists will resort to over-participation in Korea may not be made until UN forces threaten to cross the 38th parallel. This report presents direct threats to the UN forces if they decide to cross the 38th parallel. Furthermore, this memorandum proves that the United States government agencies were aware of the mass quantities of Chinese troops in North Korea, and Mao Zedong prepared Chinese forces for war if UN forces crossed the 38th parallel." In addition to this memorandum, the Article 2 Strategic Intelligence Mistakes in Korea 1950 by CIA intelligence officer PK Rose remarks that the CIA knew that the PLA had over 300,000 troops in the border area, further stating, "T intelligence leadership in both Washington and Tokyo did not alert either President Truman or MacArthur, who were about to meet on Wake Island to discuss the conduct of war. The threat of Chinese forces was known but not correctly transferred to where the JCS and the President could adequately address the threat." In the morning hours of October 15, 1950, a meeting in Wake Island occurred between prominent U.S. officials. In this meeting, President Truman and other military and government advisors met to plan the unification of Korea. This meeting was influential in the planning of creating a united Korea and how to ensure Korean unification works. The Wake Island Conference was the last meeting before the UN decided to cross the 38th parallel and pursue a united Korea. Dean Rusk, the Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, was present during the meeting. In the meeting, Dean Rusk never mentioned the memorandum he received about the Chinese officials' threats about crossing the 38th parallel. The existence of reactionary violence by the Chinese military is an essential piece of information that would show the intent of China's military in the Korean War. This information would be crucial to reverse the U.S. military officials' belief that Chinese intent was lacking. Even when President Truman asked his advisors, "What are the chances for Chinese or Soviet interference?" only General MacArthur replied, "This statement gave a perfect opportunity to relay necessary Chinese threats to be considered when deciding to cross the 38th parallel, but Dean Rusk never reported it during the conference." General MacArthur was the only advisor to reply to President Truman with only positive views on military interference. MacArthur acknowledged the 300,000 Chinese military force but discounted their ability to travel to Pyongyang without a great slaughter. The absence of relaying Chinese military threats of UN military aggression was a grave failure in communication. This meeting was crucial to stop and de-escalate a deadly war. After the escalation of war due to the crossing of the 38th parallel, the U.S. found themselves in the deadly Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. The UN forces were met with massive resistance from the Chinese and North Korean forces, and this battle would alter the position of the UN forces from an offensive role to a defensive role. This battle heavily influenced peace talks due to the significant loss of life and the subsequent loss of North Korean territory. Peace talks came to fruition shortly after the fight between China and the USA. Telegram from Roshin, an advisor to Stalin, was sent about China's willingness to have a peace talk to end the war. In this telegram, China provided dire conditions for stopping their inclusion in the war. China's conditions involve withdrawing all foreign troops and allowing both Korean nations to resolve the issue themselves, that no outside nation should influence the outcome of the war. In addition, on December 13, 1950, the U.S. National Security Council created a report about their position on having a ceasefire in Korea. While also requesting the withdrawal of all foreign troops, the U.S. asked for the stoppage of the entire war. Neither North nor South Korea were to solve territorial disputes by war, while neither country was able to compromise on its demands due to the ever-changing war leverage between both nations. With the influence of two major political events happening, the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower and the death of Joseph Stalin, the Korean War armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. 3 years before the UN crossing of the 38th parallel and the hidden war with China. The Korean War was devastating to the relationship between the U.S., China, and North Korea while also having a massive death toll on all nations involved. Subsequently, this war did not achieve anything but the reassurance of South Korean sovereignty. After the war ended in 1953, the 38th parallel was still the dividing line separating Korea before the invasion. Only until President Richard Nixon met Mao Zedong did the United States begin a positive relationship with China. The historiography of the Korean War is perceived differently in each nation. The prominent Chinese perception of the Korean War is it was a war against U.S. aggression and the protection of Chinese sovereignty. In contrast, the U.S. ignores the mistakes and missteps during the war and downplays its role in leading the UN forces. The Korean War is commonly referenced as the Forgotten War in the United States. This perception leads to a confusing and silent conversation about the war's conclusion. Moreover, many questions still need to be answered about the Korean War, such as, why did Dean Rusk not mention the Chinese threats to the president at Wake Island, and did President Truman fear communist expansion? Or did he use it to gain national support for the Korean War? While I don't have those answers due to a lack of resources and evidence, those questions are essential in the motivation for the progression of the Korean War. Furthermore, due to the lack of information not correctly being relayed and the ethnocentric leadership of the United States, the Korean War progressed longer than it should have. Although, as a historian, it is not for me to speculate, but to give evidence on what situations and issues caused the war to escalate while it was de-escalating in the early days of October. Thank you for sticking around. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you would like to hear more history from this channel. See you next time.